Since we're the full cast of panelists, I propose that we sort of go ahead and get started. So as I was mentioning earlier, I'll begin with a sort of short introduction of the University of Chicago. So I'm Francois Richard. I'm in the anthropology department at the University of Chicago, and I'm this year's academic director of the University of Chicago Center in Paris. And we are here gathered for what is a celebration of Dipesh Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe, right? These two kinds of occasions. The first one is the 20th anniversary of the book, which came out in 2000. And the second one is the occasion of its re-edition in France with an introduction by Thomas Brisson, who is one of today's panelists. So we imagined this particular event as part of a series of 3 events that will address the book's reception and legacies in various intellectual and geopolitical contexts, and of course, more generally, the entailments of postcolonial theory and postcolonial thought today. And obviously, these are, at least in France, topics of the most extreme actuality, and historically as well, given the fact that the book's reception in France has been vexed to be at the most generous. So as I was mentioning, I just want to sort of talk very briefly about the University of Chicago Center in Paris. We're the University of Chicago's French satellite. We're the campus located in the 13th arrondissement. Obviously, because of the sanitary condition, most of our activities have been suspended. The center has been largely closed. But in general, our activities tend to focus on 3 sets of things: a pedagogical axis, which essentially revolves around teaching courses for University of Chicago undergraduate students, a research axis, which is about facilitating research for University of Chicago faculty working in France or in Europe more generally, and then a broader kind of mandate, which is about the promotion of synergies, articulation, collaborations, events between our university and its researchers and scholars working in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East, which is, of course, the occasion which brings us together today. So I'm just going to make a very brief personal mention of Provincializing Europe, which is one of the books I would actually take if I were to be stranded on a desert island. It's one of the books when I read it in graduate school, which was absolutely completely changed my thinking in graduate school. It was a transformative event as a young person working in the Atlantic and colonial history of West Africa. And I took its invitation to do history otherwise in stride. It radically expanded and recontoured the horizon of my research. And I've read the book very, very, very many times. I've taught it probably even more. And every time its central ideas just hit me with renewed resonance and renewed relevance, and the indispensability and inadequacies of European thought for thinking about political histories elsewhere. Dipesh's inspired reading of Marx and the 2 histories of capital, his taking full stride forward the subaltern histories agenda and sort of teaching us and telling us how to do and how to think about histories of labor, his encouragement to think about the plurality of historical times, his attention to life worlds and inhabitations of modernity. And of course, there's more. His book is truly an incontrovertible waypoint. In fact, a place, I would say, in the scholarship on historical epistemology, on historical thought, and the imagination of political futures, not just in Europe, but and its imperial extensions, but absolutely everywhere. Before I close my remarks, I just want to thank wholeheartedly on behalf of the center all of the participants for making the event possible, in particular Sylvain Bourmeau, our moderator, and of course all of the panelists, Thomas Brisson, Ewa Domanska, José Neves, Lisa Wedeen, Achille Mbembe, and of course the man of the day, Dipesh himself. So I'm very excited about the conversation that is about to take place, and I will turn it over to Sylvain. Thank you very much.
I'm very happy to be a part of this conversation tonight in association with the online newspaper that I edit, AOC. and as a neighbor to the Chicago University Center in Paris as well, which is a great place to have debates. And I'm very happy to have the opportunity to hear you tonight in this context, a very scaring context of public debate in France at the moment on some of the issues that we are going to talk about. So I'm very happy that we can have a serious conversation, whereas not very important things are happening about which the media is actually talking too much. So I won't say more about these things, and I'm happy also to take part in this double celebration, which is an opportunity to deparochialize France in many ways, because it has become a habit for us now, unfortunately, to have to wait a very long time before books are translated. It was probably different in the 70s or even in the 80s, but it's an old habit. I mean, some of the authors that are talked about in Dipesh Chakrabarty's book, someone as famous as Max Weber is still not totally translated into French, and it's an exception in this country, a very interesting one. So deparochializing France is a program, and this conversation is taking part in this. So what I will propose tonight is that we are going to hear about the reception of this book that has been published 20 years ago now, with a second edition about 10 years after, and this new edition in France. The reception has been different in different parts of the world, because of course it depended on the way the debates were organized in each country, but also on many different political, historical reasons, of course. And so in many ways, the reception of the book is part of the topic of the book itself. And I think it's why it's very interesting to hear you, all of you, tonight. So we will start with Thomas Brisson, who is a political scientist, who is a professor of political science at the University of Paris 8, Vincennes-Saint Denis, and who published recently a book about the way postcolonial theory has been received especially in France. Then we will hear Ewa Domanska, who is a professor of human sciences at the Department of History at Mickiewicz University in Poznan in Poland, about the general reception in Europe of your book, Dipesh. Then we will go to Portugal. This is the only good thing about doing these video seminars, is that we can travel all over the world very easily, very quickly. With you, José Neves, who was an assistant professor in the Department of History in Lisboa, Universidade Nova de Lisboa, and you will talk about this reception of the book in other linguistic areas and geographic areas, and then we will move to the US with Lisa Wedeen, who is a professor of political science at the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, who was associated with this event as well, about the reception, I guess, in the US, and we will know a more general aspect
in the Middle East.
In the Middle East, sorry. Yes, of course. I got confused, and then we will close this round with Achille Mbembe, who was as well a political scientist and an historian, who was a professor at Witwatersrand University in South Africa. We will talk about the way the book has been influential for him as well. And then Dipesh Chakrabarty will have the opportunity to answer, I guess not all, but some of the remarks that will be made because and then we will, I hope, have some time for some questions from the public. So don't lose more time. And maybe Thomas, you're ready to start.
So many thanks. I'm very pleased and very honored to be with you today. It's a great pleasure to discuss Dipesh's book, which for me was also like very influential and very important. I would like to see the opportunity offered by this web seminar organized by the University of Chicago in Paris to reflect upon the fate of provincializing Europe in France. I think that this should allow us to raise the question of how a major text of the postcolonial studies was read and understood or not in a former colonial power. As a matter of fact, what I want to address is the somehow marginal reception of provincializing Europe if we compare it to the global fame that the book has achieved. I will try to show that this is not specific to provincializing Europe. In fact, only a handful of the major texts of the subaltern studies and postcolonial studies have been translated and discussed in France. This should prompt us to launch a critical examination of the various reasons and explanations for the situation, which I hope will allow us to better understand what postcolonial theories can or cannot do to help us to get a better understanding of our current and complicated political situation. So let me start by giving you some contextual data about provincializing Europe in France. The book was first translated in 2009, as Sylvain just said, which is 9 years after it was first published, and has been republished a few months ago. This is Dipesh Chakrabarty's only translated text in French, save for one article and one foreword, both of them dealing with climate change and ecological issues. This is, of course, very little, but in fact, it's much more than many others. There is still no translation in French of Ranajit Guha. There is nothing of Partha Chatterjee. There is nothing of Gagan Prakash, to name just a few. Gayatri Spivak is somehow luckier, but with just a few translations, including Can the Subaltern Speak, at the same publishing house Provincializing Europe was published in. Edward Said might be the only influential postcolonial theorist who has achieved some recognition in France, with Orientalism being translated in 1980, just 2 years after it was first published in the US. And Said has also been like more regularly at least, translated after that. But even Said, like all these otherwise highly influential scholars I referred to before, has remained somehow confidential in France, where postcolonial theories have barely made it to the mainstream. So how can we account for such a state of affairs? We can first, I think, get a sociological explanation by looking at who were the scholars, who have been the scholars and the publishing houses involved in translating and introducing provincializing Europe, as well as the postcolonial theories in France. What is striking, I believe, is the difference between, let's say, the somehow authoritative position of postcolonial theories in the English-speaking world, and it's somehow a marginal one in France. In the US, after they were introduced by Guha, Spivak, and Said in 1989, subaltern and postcolonial theories could get a foothold in the most powerful universities of the East and West Coast, where they actually originally developed. Major publishing houses in the UK and the US were also instrumental in making postcolonial theories the global theories that we know today. In France, on the other side, it is outsiders who have been translating and commenting postcolonial theories. Compared to Princeton University Press, where Provincializing Europe was first published, the Édition Amsterdam is a very minor player. Actually, it was named so to pay a tribute to Spinoza, and it aims at publishing books of scholars, a quote, from the fringes. Likewise, if you look with micro-sociological lenses who has written on Chakrabarty and the postcolonial in France, you find people belonging to peripheral universities with a lower stature in the academia, more women from different ethnic backgrounds, and so on and so on. So I hope it is obvious that those are absolutely not disparaging comments, of course. It's quite the contrary. Provincializing Europe's position in France today is very much an avant-garde or vanguard one. Interestingly, it is structurally very similar to what the subaltern and then the postcolonial studies used to be in the 1980s and 1990s. Let's remember that when Guhar first put together the group of the subaltern studies at the beginning of the 1980s, it was made of outsiders and somehow marginal scholars who were interested in uncovering the repressed voices of modern Indian history. The situation in France today is that a strange kind of time travel. Yet, it also requires a broader frame of understanding to account for why a former colonial country has been so reluctant to use the postcolonial theories to make sense of its own history. And this is what I will briefly try to develop now. So let me first consider what may look like a rather commonplace explanation, which might be quite significant though. French readers, when they actually read Provincializing Europe, are somehow surprised to discover that it is a book about the history of India. True, there is also like a broader theoretical frame and a strong epistemological argument, but they're exemplified with regards to Indian historiography. So albeit apparently trivial, the point is important. French colonization took place in North Africa, in the Arab world, in the African world, and in some part of Southeast Asia. But India is comparatively a very little known country with no significance to France's colonial history. This may explain why Edward Said, on the contrary, is the only postcolonial theorist who has been regularly translated in French, as he engages with the Arab world and very directly with French Orientalism. Likewise, this could explain why one of the first academic journals that dealt with Indian postcolonial theorists failed to properly put them at the center of the mainstream intellectual discussion. So in 2000, Véronique Benet and Jacques Pushpadas, who are both of them leading specialists of India in France, published a special issue of the journal L'Homme, which was founded by Claude Lévi-Strauss, dedicated to the Indian subaltern or postcolonial scholars. But they did so with a focus on the Indian context, discussing their relevance for the scholarship on India rather than for a comparative understanding of colonial settings. Subaltern theoreticians were therefore considered part of Indian studies, again, a rather small field in France. So this does not mean that Provincializing Europe has not somehow entered a broader theoretical discussion on the colonial and postcolonial discussion. But here again, this very discussion failed to fully integrate the specific argument of the book for reasons that we'll discuss now. As suggested before, postcolonial theoreticians in France have not managed to gain a strong foothold in central universities. This has resulted in a loosely integrated discussion with few institutional places and positions and very few academic journals fully devoted to these issues. As a consequence, the academic postcolonial discussion has been characterized by two features. First of all, it has not only focused on colonial issues, but has encompassed a host of other topics, such as gender, sexual, or ethnic minorities. Secondly, it has embarked on a more political course, the academic discussion being somehow linked to political and activist concerns. Here again, there is absolutely nothing wrong with this, of course. The only thing that I want to stress is that the patterns of the discussion have been detrimental to a long-standing and deep engagement with the book. Too often, Provincializing Europe has been treated as a slogan, a catchword, leaving aside the many qualifications and nuances of the book. A very common misunderstanding, for instance, is the idea that European knowledge should be avoided to promote pristine, non-Western ways of thinking, notwithstanding the fact that Provincializing Europe clearly states that it is not possible yet, and very likely, or maybe not that desirable neither. It is also very possible that Dipesh Chakrabarty's book shares with Spivak's most famous article what we could call the curse of the title. Can the subaltern speak? And Provincializing Europe are striking titles enough so that, so it seems in France, a more careful understanding of the lines of reasoning has not been necessary here. The very fact that self-proclaimed opponents of the postcolonial theories have used similar arguments, again, neglecting the complexity of the book, has further weakened the scientific discussion. Let me then conclude by tackling a final issue. My point so far has been that one of the reasons Provincializing Europe did not get in France the recognition it had otherwise gained has to be found in the structure of the academic field and the way it has shaped the scientific discussion. This point, I believe, must nevertheless be addressed more carefully. It is also the case, but this is also the case, albeit less directly, with many philosophers, I think of Deleuze, Derrida, Foucault, who often had ties with the former colonial worlds. And incidentally, I think that it is no coincidence that these very philosophers became important references for many postcolonial thinkers. So these early debates, I believe, actually account for the uneasy reception of the postcolonial theories in France. There is, first of all, a time discrepancy. The subaltern group began working together at the beginning of the 1980s, exactly at the moment French academics assumed that the postcolonial debates that had been raging during the 2 previous decades was over. Moreover, and this might be the main explanation for provincializing Europe's complicated reception in France, the outcome of these debates led most of the French scientists to take a position that is the opposite of the one advocated in provincializing Europe. So to make a very long and very complicated story as simple as possible, let's say that the soul-searching debate on the role played by French knowledge during the colonization brought the following conclusions. Yes, colonial knowledge was instrumental in subjugating colonized people. Yes, also, this very knowledge should be amended and redesigned. And yes, finally, social sciences should be used to promote understanding between different cultures, unlike what they did before. But in no case should this deep transformation lead to question the very nature and validity of those sciences. To put it differently, the postcolonial debate of the 1960s and 1970s in France fell short of questioning the universality of Western social and human sciences. These sciences are supposed to remain valid whenever and wherever they are used. And this is, I believe, the main point of contention with provincializing Europe. As we know, one of the book's main theses is precisely that because history too is always lurking beneath the false homogeneity of history one, different accounts of non-Western history and society are waiting to be written. True, Dipesh Chakrabarty is very clear on the fact that there is a strong utopian dimension in the idea of provincializing Europe. In provincializing Western bodies of knowledge, and that we may not now, maybe never, fully develop such alternative accounts. But this idea is deeply logical and deeply coherent with this basic premise of the non-homogeneity of the modern historical time. For us, it means that it did put provincializing Europe on a position antagonist with what is still a deeply shared understanding of the universal validity of the social sciences in France. Therefore, explaining, I think, the complicated reception it had there. So let me finish my speech more lightly, though. I said before that the postcolonial theory in France today are in a position similar to what they used to be in the UK or the US 30 or 40 years ago. That is surely a pity, but that might be a good thing as well. After all, they have not become these canonical references that they are elsewhere, and this might be a blessing in disguise. Provincializing Europe in France is still a polemical, challenging, and hotly debated text. Good so. To be still the avant-garde 20 years after it was first published is definitely not bad. So in this sense, then a very happy birthday.
Thank you very much, Thomas Brisson, for this account and of the reception of this book in the French context, and also replacing it into a broader panorama of the postcolonial studies. Now that we have the account of what happened in this country in France, we will be able to compare, is there a French exception to the reception of provincializing Europe? Maybe we shall broader the horizon with you, Ewa Domanska. You will talk about Europe in a broader sense, I guess.
I am delighted to be here and to be able to speak for actually East Central Europe. I would like to thank to Dipesh that he actually acknowledged in the introduction to 2007 edition of Provincializing Europe that there is a region of the world which is called post-socialist Eastern Europe. So there is an acknowledgement that this region exists, and thank you very much for that. I would like to very briefly sketch 4 points. First one is my intellectual affiliation with Dipesh, because as many other intellectuals from East Central Europe, I consider myself as a post-colonial intellectual. What I mean by that is that we studied in East European countries, various countries, and we usually went to the West, to Western Europe or to United States, got our PhD, came back and start to decolonize our intellectual environment around us. It has advantages and disadvantages. And I hope that I might also put on the table the problem of the legacy of Marxism, since Dipesh was very clear with his excellent conversation with José Neves in Lisbon in 2002, that where he said that he never became an anti-Marxist and that he never alienated himself from Marxism. Well, this is very similar situation in East Central Europe, especially for younger generation. Because like myself, I was educated in the Marxist environment, non-dogmatic Marxism, I would like to stress. I have 2 Marxist masters, Jerzy Topolski and Hayden White. So they very successfully make me a kind of a Marxist thinker in a very unusual way. So the interesting situation with reception of post-colonialism, and especially Dipesh book in East Central Europe, is that after '89, the older generation was trying to reject Marxism, while post-colonialism is obviously based on Gramsci and Althusser and other Marxist thinkers, and there is no post-colonialism without Marxism. So I wonder what is going on right now after so many years. I have to admit that after reading Dipesh book, I was assured that Marxism, even after a very painful experience of using Marxism as a pure political tool and ideology, is still from theoretical point of view a very interesting theory to speak about capital, about modernity, and about capitalism, of course. And I wonder what Dipesh would say about the recent development of Marxist and interspecies historical materialism or post-humanist Marxism, since I think that Dipesh moved from provincializing Europe to provincializing the earth. I wonder if Marxist in this new costume might be useful for his recent interest in Anthropocene. So this was a very brief sketch about how we became post-colonial intellectuals in different provinces. My colleague Piotr Piotrowski, a very known art historian, has a saying, "Provinces of the world unite." I feel a very strong affiliation with especially South Africa, with South America, with scholars from Brazil, Argentina, Mexico. I think that intellectually we are in a very similar situation. What the provincializing Europe did to us together with scholars from South America, like Enrico Dussel and Walter Mignolo, Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who are talking about geography of knowledge, is just to ensure us that this kind of delinking from Western way of thinking is somehow necessary to become who we are right now. But that's, of course, the problem. I'm not speaking about nativism. But also, it makes us aware that post-colonial thinking is lacking a kind of engagement with indigenous ways of knowing. This is what I learned from my colleagues in South America, who are coming from South America, which is very interesting, coming in a very interesting way, coming to East Central Europe. There are more and more books and articles being published, the translation of Walter Mignolo and Dussel and other scholars from Southern America. That post-colonial theory that was represented by Dipesh has been somehow replaced by post-colonial theory, which is coming from Brazil, from Argentina, and from Mexico. So why is it so? And now my second point is as follows: that in between 2000 and 2010, when scholars associated with subaltern studies group were coming into Poland, their book have been translated and they become very popular. Postcolonial theory was considered as a tool to decolonize Eastern European scholarship from French theory. French theory was a shifter. It helped in East Central Europe to shift our intellectual interest after 89. However, because of this post-structuralist, deconstructivist background, it was considered as a kind of ambiguous. It deactivated our political action. The political action were moved to intellectual sphere of fights between texts. So this is the struggle. Of course, this is a common accusation of post-colonial theory informed by the construction of post-structuralism. But this was also something like that in East Central Europe, that at some point it was considered as a kind of deactivization of from political struggle. So this would be my second point: how post-colonial scholarship presented by provincializing Europe might be also used as a tool to decolonize us from French theory. The other issue is the relationship, which was very nicely indicated in Provincializing Europe, between the post-colonial and post-secular. I consider it as a very important aspect, especially right now, when post-secular condition is getting more and more visible, together with the populism and rightist movement, the movement of the right, and so on. The true revolution is a conservative revolution right now. There is no revolution coming from the left in East Central Europe. So the question is how post-colonial theory, how books like Dipesh Provincializing Europe can actually decolonize our thinking in the way of free us from the idea that the only religion is Christianity, or in case of Poland, Catholicism. Since Dipesh is talking not only about monotheistic religion, he's talking about spirituality. And this is what I find also emancipating and liberating, right? So My personal view is that animism is right now the best approach, the best cosmology that we might advocate to get the idea of adaptation and resilience productive. And of course, I'm not talking about animism in the anthropological way, but as treating other forms of existence or being as persons or ancestors. I hope we can talk about it. So this is really very interesting, liberating point in provincializing Europe. And just to say a few words more, how the postcolonial scholarship is, what is the condition of postcolonial scholarship right now, as I see it, at least in this part of Europe. Well, the problem is that we have too many terms, and we very quickly, I think too quickly, move from postmodernism through posthumanism to anthropocenism. It's too fast. And it has to do with the idea that East Central Europe still have to catch up with what is going on in Western Europe and in the US. That it's still the problem that we feel somehow inferior, that we feel that the theory will not come from this part of the world. It will come again from France, from Germany, from England, but not from here. We are just giving very interesting case studies, but we are somehow theoretically challenged. That's not true. The problem is that at least when I studied, nobody told me that I can actually create my own theory. So the provincializing Europe and Dipesh particularly is so important for us, because Dipesh, and of course it is related to his Marxist and our Marxist background, is very theoretically oriented. Okay. So what I start to do, at least, is to teach students how to create their own theories. And I use grounded theory that is coming from sociology in a very successful way. So thank you very much, Dipesh, for decolonizing us. Dipesh came to Poland in 2009. I hope that you were not disappointed in the same way as Samir Amin was disappointed after coming to Hungary, and being very skeptical about our how we can progress and catch up with modernity. I hope that you had a different experience, and this was just a couple of ideas that I hope might also link East Central Europe to other regions of the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ewa Domanska, for this account of your own personal reading of the book, and also the way it took place in this context of Eastern Europe. We now move to Lisbon with you, José Neves, and you just very recently co-edited with Marcos Cardao an issue of a journal called Práticas da História about this anniversary, this 20th anniversary of the book.
Oh, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, so to speak, and therefore I want to thank Arnaud Colombel, who made the invitation for me to participate in this event. And actually, it is great that there is a second French edition of Provincializing Europe. Of course, this is a fact that somehow testifies to the unevenness of Europe's intellectual advancements, as there is not even one Portuguese edition of Dipesh Chakrabarty's famous book. Anyway, I would like just to briefly highlight the importance that Provincializing Europe and work of Dipesh Chakrabarty have for me, and the relevance it may have for historiographical or political debates in Portugal. But first of all, actually, let me just situate, even if in very general terms, the Portuguese intellectual context of reception of post-colonial studies, specifically considering debates on colonial history, post-colonial legacies, but also discussions on the decolonization of knowledge. Concerning historians and the discipline of history in particular, I must confess that Provincializing Europe, the reception of the book, is not very significant. Portuguese historiographical production on his empire, it can be, even if briefly summarized in perhaps two trends. One of them directly connected, inspired perhaps also in the works of another Indian historian, Sanjay Subramaniam, who has also a strong connection to a Portuguese historian of the Portuguese Empire, or as he says, the Portuguese presence in Asia. His name is Luís Filipe Tomás. And there the perspective of Portuguese presence, of Portuguese Empire actually, is an empire that mainly developed through a kind of a spiritual, religious, but also commercial network. And as you all know, perhaps, Subramaniam's works on the entangled history from the Tagus here in Lisbon to the Ganges, they somehow match, even if not perfectly, with this vision of an empire that actually, more than an impositive force, developed and expanded through this kind of fluidity assured by what they call religious relations or commercial relations. On the other hand, within Portuguese historians, there is of course a significant scholarship on based on the history of empire as practiced by historical sociologists, for instance. But in those cases, while more critical and more skeptical towards the legacy of the Portuguese Empire and its history, there are not significant concerns towards, I would say, the epistemology of the discipline, or to put it more properly, post-colonial or post-modern approaches to the limits of the discipline of history are quite often disregarded by these colleagues working on the history of Portuguese Empire. But outside the field of history, of course, post-colonial studies and also particularly Dipesh Chakrabarty work has some relevance. This is obviously the case of the Coimbra Social Studies School. The main author is Boaventura de Sousa Santos, and his theorization of the epistemologies of the South, although not often acknowledging the continuities or the differences comparing to the work of Dipesh Chakrabarty, there are, of course, significant familiarities. And then literary studies and comparative studies, but mainly based on literary studies, they played a major role in the diffusion of Dipesh Chakrabarty's work in Portugal. This is the case, of course, of Manuela Ribeiro Sanchez. And actually, it was her work as a translator, as a reader of Dipesh Chakrabarty that firstly influenced an historian like myself. But I will read the paper. I wrote a short paper so that I just can keep within the 15 minutes. And I will spare it to autobiographical details, and I will not also, once again, evoke directly, try to synthesize Provincializing Europe's main contributions. And I will, for that purpose, evoke a third person, a third element, that not myself and as a reader of Dipesh, and not Dipesh as the author we are discussing. So I will read. The Portuguese philosopher Eduardo Lourenço died on the 3rd of December of 2020 at the age of 97. Born in a small village in the Portuguese hinterland, Lourenço graduated in history and philosophical sciences in the mid-40s from Portugal's oldest university, the University of Coimbra. An erudite reader of Montaigne and Kierkegaard, critical towards the fascist dictatorship, but also nurturing a heterodox stance vis-à-vis the Communist Party, he had a distinguished international academic career, which took him to German and Brazilian universities until settling in France in the 60s, teaching at the University of Nice, where he retired in the late 80s. Over the following years, and until his recent death, France conferred the following honors on him: the National Order of Merit in 1996, the Order of Arts and Letters 2000, and the National Order of the Legion of Honor 2002. In Portugal, in addition to the many prizes and honors he received during his lifetime, the national government declared the day of national mourning after his death. At the time the philosopher died, public opinion in Portugal cherished Lourenço as the great thinker of a Portuguese national identity, a reputation he had already earned during his final decades. The main obituaries on his life highlighted his reflections on Portuguese society's relation with the memory of the dictatorship, reflections which he developed in the late 70s. And praises also emphasized his later thesis on European culture, which he developed during the 80s and the 90s. It was as though Eduardo Lourenço's ruminations had escorted Portugal's geocultural and political trajectory from European center of the last Western Empire to part of the southern periphery of the European Union, by the way, which Portugal joined in 1986. At the time when Eduardo Lourenço died, I was doing proofreading of a special issue already mentioned today of the journal Prática of the História, dedicated to the 20th anniversary of Provincializing Europe, an issue I had the pleasure of organizing with my colleague Marcos Cardão. My first interest in what would be Chakrabarty's most praised work, Provincializing Europe, arose during my PhD, which examined the attitude of the Portuguese communists vis-à-vis nationalism and national identity over the course of the 20th century. During my doctoral research, which took place in the first years of our century, there were two books whose reading had a great impact on me: Nationalist Thought and the Colonial World, a Derivative Discourse by Partha Chatterjee, and Marxist Theory and Nationalist Politics, The Case of Colonial India by Sanjay Seth. I came across Provincializing Europe after reading these books, which stimulated my interest in historians whose careers are more or less associated with the trajectory of subaltern studies, from Sanjay Seth to Chatterjee, from Chakrabarty to the founding figure of Ranajit Guha. However, it was only a few years later, when I began to teach the course of Theory of History at the University of Lisbon, that Provincializing Europe actually became an important reference for me. In this course, I tried to persuade students about the need to historicize the discipline of history, suggesting that they shall not feel obliged to practice it. That is, suggesting that they can legitimize their engagement in this profession by confessing their own desire to do so, and not so much by appealing to a human, universal, or national need to discover, to know, or to take care of the past. But let me return to Eduardo Lourenço and his recent passing. As Lourenço became prized as the great thinker on Portugal and Portuguese identity, a posthumous dispute also broke out in relation to his positions on the colonial question. In this dispute, there were, on the one hand, those who praised him for having defended, during the final years of his life, the celebration of the so-called Portuguese discoveries, a historical subject which the Lisbon Town Hall plans to honor by dedicating it a museum. On the other hand, anti-racist activists, as well as historians and social scientists casting a critical eye on Portugal's imperial past, evoked and flagged essays that Lourenço had written in the 60s and 70s, criticizing Portuguese colonialism and calling upon Portuguese society to examine its imperial and colonial present and past condition. I've been following this dispute that still goes on as Lourenço's life and work is being addressed by obituaries published in all sorts of literary magazines and academic journals in Portugal. Facing the dispute and reading the tributes paying homage to Lourenço, I take the side, as you perhaps can imagine, of the anti-colonial Lourenço. But at the same time, however it may be appropriate, apart from underscoring Lourenço's anti-colonialism, to question the figure of the thinker he himself embodies, and to suggest the constructed nature of such figure. Throughout the last decades, Lourenço was celebrated not only as the key thinker of Portugal identity, but as the paradigmatic figure of the thinker per se. He was configured as the personification of the thinker par excellence. Therefore, decolonizing Lourenço entails rescuing his forgotten anti-colonial writings, but may also mean upsetting his profile as the thinker or the intellectual or the philosopher. For such a decolonizing purpose, let me clarify my understanding of some of the most sweeping political and phenomenological consequences to be taken from Dipesh Chakrabarty post-colonial critique of the discipline of history and humanities. I am not going to propose here and now a history of the figure of the thinker. I do not have the time or the knowledge to do that. However, as some colleagues working on the fringe of comparative political theory have suggested, this is a figure whose reputed universality often conceals parochial genealogies. If we accept this suggestion, the question that may arise is the following one. How can we historians contribute toward questioning such reputed universality? To answer this question, the work of Dipesh Chakrabarty is of great help, as it argues for the situatedness of modern Western knowledge, considering the positionality of the context of such knowledge, but also the particularities of the forms and methods it conveys, and last but not the least, opening the floor for a discussion on the artificiality of the types of figures such knowledge may deploy or correspond to: the intellectual, the thinker, the scientist, and of course, the historian. In this context, I would like to call your attention to an essay by Dipesh that was published for the first time in 2006, I believe, Subaltern History as Political Thought. It was translated into Portuguese, into Spanish, but in this case, I don't think it was translated to French. It is an essay in which we find many of the ideas that were already present in Provincializing Europe. But it is an essay that interests me particularly due to the way Dipesh takes a critical stance in relation to British Marxist historiography and simultaneously evokes the example of Jacques Rancière, author of La Nuit des Prolétaires, philosophical historical work, fiercely dedicated to questioning the very figure and condition of the thinker. In Subaltern History as Political Thought, by once again making the 20th century history of India a source for his theoretical speculations, Dipesh Chakrabarty issues the following challenge to historians. How can we write the history of politics as performed by the masses? He then provides two examples he considers both unsatisfactory. He finds the first example in the classic 1978 work by Georges Roudet, The Crowd in History, a study of popular disturbances in France and England. Major contributor to the tradition of history from below, in this work, Roudet contradicted an elitist and conservative interpretation of the 18th and 19th century European history and attempted to devolve political prominence to the masses, to the crowd. However, the path followed by Roudet ended up, even if unintentionally, in the naturalization of individuality, decomposing the crowd into people with their own particular faces and names. Georges Roudet held his historiographical imagination hostage of the figure of the individual, presumed as the most natural form of human and political life. More than Roudet's subordination to a liberal doctrine, The problem Dipesh Chakrabarty points to involves methodological aspects because Rude's attempt to humanize the crowd is possible insofar as it benefits from the info accumulated in police archives with the purpose of identification, and persecution of individuals and members of the revolutionary crowd. Rude is thus confined to a phenomenology of politics based on notions of responsibility, guilt, or merit. These notions, while deemed to be universal, are certainly particular to the political mindset that became hegemonic in the modern West. The second unsatisfactory example of how not to write the history of popular collective politics that is given by Dipesh Chakrabarty in this essay has to do with his own previous work, namely his doctoral research. Despite his intentions, he too was insensible to the subtleness and intangibility of collective subjectivization, at least in parts of the work. I quote Dipesh: "In my own research on the history of the jute mill workers of Calcutta, I would come across complaints on the part of European factory inspectors that workers would clamor as a matter of habit instead of taking turns to speak. The inspectors would have to tell them to speak one by one. It was, of course, this so-called clamor that was the speech of a collective agent, though, like my factory inspectors, I also missed the cue." End of quotation. Now, being sensitive and making sense of the historical processes of collective subjectivization is, of course, a great intellectual challenge. A challenge confronting historians, both at the level of this study of popular politics and social movements, as well as at the level of the history of ideas and political thought. That is, it is a challenge that involves the history of French revolutionary crowds and of the Calcutta jute mill workers, as well as the history of the great thinkers to whom the French Republic and the Portuguese state conceive prestigious and noble honors. In truth, indeed, one can even say that relativizing the boundary between both levels is perhaps an important task if an historian actually wants to become sensitive to and make sense of what we may call popular collective subjectivization. This relativization of the boundary can be promoted through historiographical and philosophical gestures, such as the ones performed by Jacques Rancière in his La Nuit des Prolétaires or in his Le Maître Ignorant, where the figure of the thinker and the idea of the canon are undermined. But such undermining also requires a historiographical practice inspired by postcolonial criticism. In fact, and to finish, I would like to suggest that Rancière's project and postcolonial criticism may well benefit from each other. Rancière's undermining of the figure of the thinker is quite helpful in pointing some of the limits, conditioning perhaps current attempts to decolonize knowledge. Such attempts sometimes concentrate their efforts on appealing to the inclusion of non-European, non-Western political thinkers in the literary canon or in the academic curricula. If we all probably accept the tactical and strategic pertinence of these inclusive efforts, they may nevertheless leave the very figure of the thinker unquestioned, if not even reinforce its quest for universality. On the other hand, Rancière's idea of emancipation, while productively troubling the paternalist stance of Western progressive political movements and cultural and educational projects, can perhaps benefit from the insights offered by historians committed to postcolonial criticism. These insights tell us that even the idea of emancipation is deemed to be situated and parochial. For instance, in Subject Lessons, a 2007 book on the history of Western education in colonial India, historian Sanjay Seth argues that British concerns with the fact that Indian students were acquiring Western education by rote memorization and therefore were not acquiring true and emancipatory knowledge, reflected more than anything else the colonizers' anxiety that Western education was failing to produce the modern subjects it presupposed. Sanjay Seth thus argues for the non-universality of Western knowledge. Along the same lines, relativizing the very notion of emancipation and of the ideas of self-criticism and heterodoxy, we find Dipesh Chakrabarty stimulating thoughts written in the last decade on the challenges posed to the humanities and to our modern political phenomenology by the question of the Anthropocene. On such matters, Dipesh has recently stated how categories such as emancipation and liberation take part in an anthropomorphization of life that perhaps limits our capacity to politically think as members of the planet and not only as humans. But this is, of course, a topic for another conversation. As to provincializing Europe, I just hope that we will finally be able to publish it in Portugal. It will surely help us provincializing the notion of discovery as legitimized by Eduardo Lourenço in his later years. This notion, which in Portugal during the 90s was frequently mobilized, along with the idea that the Portuguese expansion paved the way for so-called globalization of goods, people, and knowledge, seems to have been made to measure for the analytical judgment of provincializing Europe, because it undoubtedly says more about the particular situation of the colonizer than about the non-existence, the previous non-existence of the colonized populations or territories. That is, it is a notion that reflects the colonizer's lack of knowledge, but because of the force of the colonizer himself, the notion seems universal, and it became synonymous with the achievement of an objective knowledge of the world. So I hope that we will organize another conversation when we are able to launch the Portuguese translation of Dipesh's book. Thank you.
Thank you, José Neves, for this communication, and thank you for broadening the scope. We will now go to the US to talk about the Middle East and how the book was received in another part of the world. Lisa Wedeen.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Paris Center for hosting this remarkable event. I promise I didn't collaborate with Thomas beforehand, but I have a similar opening. That is to say, coming up with the title as seductive and captivating as Provincializing Europe must be a blessing and a curse. A blessing because of its provocations and the invitation to decolonize or relativize Europe in our analyses. The invitation is to reject the invidious distinctions cultivated in so many theories of modernity and modernization, which means foregoing recourse to teleology and historicist narratives of transition, relinquishing Europe's status as a stand-in for the universal, as well as the West's overwhelming claim on social science categories of analysis globally. The seductive title is also a curse because it is so easily quotable without necessarily occasioning the engagement the book so thoroughly deserves. Many of my colleagues have already discussed its generative qualities, and I intend to follow suit by talking about aspects of the book that have proved to be especially compelling in my own work. First, however, I have been asked to provide a brief account of the book's influence in the region I study, the Middle East, so let me just start there. The major influence of provincializing Europe on intellectuals in the Middle East is signaled by a particularly well-done translation of Michael Hart's review of the book by Karim Mohammed in Al Jazeera in 2017. And the analysis underscores the importance of the inextricable links among capitalism, knowledge production, and the claims to an abstract universalism that ride roughshod over particularity, over difference, over those aspects of lived experience that escape the totalizing aspirations of colonial, imperial, and capitalist control. Whereas universalism aspires to homogeneity with all the problems that suggests, its chief ambition is transcending difference. And Middle East intellectuals welcomed Chakrabarty's critique of universalism in this vein. They understood his views of difference as expressive of and vital to existing life worlds, as opposed to a pejorative othering. In short, to put it reductively, Chakrabarty's trenchant critiques of Eurocentrism were met with a welcome reception in a Middle East that has too often found itself vulnerable to the European and American machinations and interventions. Like the late Edward Said, who famously charted the connections between empire and distinct forms of knowledge, Chakrabarty invites us to examine our own normative and institutional conditions of myth-making within the social sciences, ones that have too often dealt in visions of the colonial, have dealt in visions of the colonial other with the other as somehow lacking or backward. These visions so well enshrined in modernization and theory and in the democratic transitology literatures in my discipline of political science are not simply embellishments of an imperial domination independently existing. They are an integral part of the project itself. Chakrabarty's book inspired my earlier work in 3 different ways. First, its calls to provincialize Europe beckoned me to deprovincialize the Middle East, borrowing Yassin al-Hajj Saleh's borrowing of Joaquin Haberlin's felicitous phrase. I would not have put it in those terms at the time, but my work has always been an effort to do precisely that, to draw on the examples of Syria and Yemen as a way of thinking about the seductions of authoritarianism in less invidious terms. This has meant exploring the disciplinary symbolic mechanisms of social control that are central to both dictatorship and democracy, learning about the ways in which ideology as form is at work in both settings, and rejecting the problematic and often sanguine, complacent, self-congratulatory distinctions between democracy and dictatorship so common in historicist literatures. It has also meant appreciating the political vitality of democratic public sphere-like practices in authoritarian contexts, as well as the transgressive role artistic practices play in rethinking the way we frame our understandings of the politics of reproduction, genre stretching, societal transformation, and indeed everyday disruptions of status quo conventionalities. Second, and relatedly, if the United States could stand in for a deterritorialized general in American political science, why couldn't Syria or Yemen do the same, offering at least a corrective to the simultaneously overreaching and increasingly narrow research projects that characterized my discipline? Now, a project initiated by Setini Shami at the SSRC soon after Chakrabarty's book was published, immediately after the onset of the Second American-initiated Iraq War, aimed to unsettle mainstream disciplinary paradigms and highlight scholarly complicity in the ongoing experience and existence of empire. My piece for the volume, entitled Scientific Knowledge, Liberalism, and Empire, American Political Science in the Modern Middle East, attempted to show how the discipline of political science enables US imperialism in the Middle East, not only by supplying democracy brokers to institutions such as the US Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq, but by putting forth affirmative, specifically liberal ideas about good governance, which are then used as standards in putatively scientific assessment that determine worthiness for sanctions or financial aid, or for that matter, justify military intervention. This is not to mention failing to offer substantial and sustained critiques of US imperialism as a general world problem, maintaining subdisciplinary boundaries that depend on the separation between fact and value, insisting that scientific...
Yeah, you were disconnected. Please go ahead.
Okay, so in short, in the post-Cold War period, political science had helped to foster what David Scott aptly calls a civilizing effect, in which being a good Muslim or a good Arab state had come increasingly to depend on a willingness, sometimes coerced, sometimes induced, to accept the normative terms, if not the actual implementation of procedural democracy as the ethos on which models of political organization are constructed and evaluated. And in the name of this principle, the Middle East and were anointed laggards and or troublemakers, taken to be a problem to be solved. In other words, the incommensurably other in need of special attention, which meant the renewed assertion of control. All of these points, indeed the underlying sensibilities I expressed in the piece, were a part of what were of a with the zeitgeist beholden to Chakrabarty as well as to Said and to Foucault and to Mbembe as well. But in a third way, Provincializing Europe influenced my work more specifically at the time. And this was in Chakrabarty's chapter 7 entitled Adda, A History of Sociality, initially published in Public Culture in 1999. Chakrabarty's reflections on the activity of Adda, a ritual of meeting and engaging in conversation in helped me to think through the practice of khatchus, which I encountered and fell in love with while doing field work in Yemen. Now, khat is a drug similar to which Yemenis routinely chewed in the afternoons in both everyday and sometimes formal social gatherings. Learning about khatchus allowed me to shift attention away from formal considerations of electoral outcomes, away from accounts that fetishize the ballot box, to the experiential dimensions of participatory politics. I was able to examine Yemeni khatchus in ways that engaged and problematized what were then prevailing conceptualizations of Habermasian public sphere theory. Yemenis, some of whom were strangers to one another, would meet daily in large rooms of houses or a civic association's offices to debate critically about literary matters, political life, and social problems. Like the salon and coffee house gatherings in Habermas's depiction, these chews varied in the size and composition of their publics, the mode of their proceedings, and the topics open to debate. Also, like their historical Western European counterparts, they were often host to formal ongoing discussions prompted perhaps by international or by local domestic problems or a special guest in attendance. Marriages were arranged and business deals solidified, village sheikhs chosen, and local troubles resolved over khat. Khatchus also circulation of important information. So khatchus were almost always segregated affairs, more men chewed than women, and the latter's conversations tended on the whole to be about concrete relations among family members, rather than about abstract political issues or current events. Indeed, women politicians tended to complain that they were being barred from an activity that was central to the work of male politicians in their constituencies. Women do not have equal access to the processes of debate and decision-making that khatchus enable, and for this reason, khatchus can be considered a form of what Chakrabarty called in chapter 7, in reference to Adda, a flawed social practice. Khatchus are segregated and predominantly male activities that are also oblivious of the materiality of labor, as Chakrabarty also notes in relation to Adda. Yet khatchuing is not a dying social practice, a vestige from a class-specific traditional past, but a widespread contemporary activity which actually became more prevalent in the 1990s and 2000s and continues to an extent even in the context of the current horrific war. In khatchu, the accessibility of officials and the openness of everyday sessions were suggestive of the horizontal or quality-inducing aspects of Yemeni public life, at least for men. And although it's important not to romanticize these gatherings, khatchus were nevertheless analogous to Habermas's 17th and 18th century European salons and coffee houses, in the sense that comparably live public sphere activities work to produce important forms of political engagement and critical debate. In Habermas's theory, sites of public sphere activity are connected with one another through anonymous media, producing reflexivity. Discussions held, in other words, in khatchu gatherings were refracted through newspapers, intellectuals' conferences, and mosque sermons. Impersonal debates held in these mediated publics also influenced the themes of khatchu conversations. Participants were often aware that the issues they were debating were being debated by others, constituting a public in a broad, anonymous, non-face-to-face sense. So khatchus fulfilled the two requirements Habermas saw as central to a public sphere, namely both citizens' engagement in critical discussion and the mediated reflexive role that such mini publics other mini publics play in helping to produce the impersonal, audience-oriented, broader public of anonymous citizens. By provincializing Europe, we learn from the experience of Yemen that there is no one path to critical, rational debate in public, or if there is, then Habermas and most modernization theorists have misidentified the circumstances under which that subjectivity conducive to such public deliberation appears. In Yemen, different historical conditions from the ones specified by Habermas and permitted the emergence of vibrant communities of argument, public, political, and in many instances, democratic, in the rich substantive sense of that term. Taking Yemen as an example allowed me to take issue with arguments that located the sources of modern public-oriented subjectivity in the bourgeois family and in the processes of state formation, ensuring the state's monopoly over violence. And Kotchus were more than just public. They also constituted important dimensions of political and even democratic activity. So my research was in many respects an enactment of provincializing Europe, not a wholehearted dismissal by any means, but an exercise in radical recentering, which entailed recovering the practices of places and experiences of belonging that were and are peripheral to Europe. Often attributed to European socialities, these activities were locally vibrant and neither nor even beholden to colonial rule, but alternative lived practices of modern politics, or in Chakrabarty's formulation, an instance where history does not and cannot sublate itself into history one. I only fully realized the presence of Chakrabarty's work in my own when I was rereading Provincializing Europe in preparation for this. What I was attempting to do was to produce an account of democracy, not dissimilar to Chakrabarty's reading of Capital, in which Capital and Capital, in which democracy becomes a site where both the universal history, history one, and the politics of human belonging, history two, are allowed to interrupt each other's narrative, as Chakrabarty writes. As Chakrabarty also notes, and I quote here, capital is a philosophical historical category. That is, historical difference is not external to it, but is rather constitutive of it. Its histories are history one, constitutively but unevenly modified by more and less powerful history twos. Histories of capital in that sense cannot escape the politics of the diverse ways of being human, unquote. In rereading Chakrabarty for this event, I was particularly taken with his nuanced analysis of abstract labor, his fruitful engagement with Marx, and the recognition that Marx's imminent critique of capital was enabled precisely by the universal characteristics he read into the category of capital itself. Without that reading, according to Chakrabarty, there can only be particular critiques of capital, but a particular critique cannot, by definition, be a critique of capital, for such a critique could not take capital as its object. Grasping the category capital entails grasping its universal constitution. That's from Chakrabarty. Therefore, as Chakrabarty notes, his reading of Marx does not, in, quote, any way obviate that need for engagement with the universal, unquote. Rather, and this bears repeating, he offers us an analysis where the universal and the particular are allowed to interrupt, even disrupt each other's narrative. That disruption entails recognizing Europe as a particular among particulars. Putting Marx in conversation with Heidegger, moreover, allowed Chakrabarty to hold simultaneously two connected but profoundly contradictory tendencies in European social thought. The one, the analytical heritage and the practice of abstraction that helps us universalize, for, as Chakrabarty writes toward the end of the book, quote, we need universals to produce critical readings of social injustices, unquote. But simply subscribing to this approach evacuates too much of the local. The hermeneutic tradition of which Heidegger is Chakrabarty's key representative works to re-inscribe within thought itself the relationship between thought and modes of human belonging or dwelling. That's from pages 254 and 55. It invites the writing of particular ways of being in the world, in this case, Bengali ones, in my case, Yemeni, and now more recently, and again, Syrian ones, into some of the universal, abstract, and deprovincialized European categories of political modernity. And my question, and let me leave you with this, Dipesh, is the following. In creating conjoined and disjunctive genealogies, you seem to want us to move away from dialectical thinking, not from generative tensions, but from a commitment to sublation. Is that right? There are passages throughout the book that are suggestive of your issues with the dialectic. I wonder whether you could say more about this here. Having just gotten my students to think dialectically, I'm interested in the kind of epistemological and methodological innovations you're bringing to the fore here. This seems like more than tarrying with the negative as well. In any case, thank you so much for such a rich reading experience. The writing dazzles, and the commitments undergirding the book are ones I share profoundly without always having the language to relay my indebtedness. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Lisa Wedeen, for this account and this question. This is not the last one, Dipesh. I guess Achille has some more for you. And if we want to have some time for questions, I better give the mic to Achille.
First of all, thank you very much, everybody, especially Dipesh. Dipesh has been, how should I put this, a faithful intellectual companion for a very, very long time. In fact, I've never said this in public, but maybe this is the occasion to do so. In fact, of course, we all have our interlocutors. Mine is clearly Dipesh. It's Arjun and a number of others. In fact, every time I write, I'm haunted by the question, okay, what would Dipesh think of this? How will he object to what I'm saying? But I know that he's a very generous mind. And I always ask those questions. They never really set me into terror. They are ingredients that help me to try to think better. So I wanted to share that anecdote. The second point is that I, over the last week, I have been rereading Provincializing Europe. I have reread it in light of ongoing controversies going on in our linguistic space, the French-speaking space, the Francoscape, if you want, which is not limited to France, which is not limited to Paris at all, which includes French former colonies, where, of course, these debates are very, very much alive. And Sylvain mentioned it before, I think Thomas also did. The fact is that until very recently, post-colonial thought, or let's just say the kind of work, Dipesh, you do, kind of work, Thomas mentioned it, people like Gayatri, a number of others, the kind of work they do has been, if not scorned, at least little known in France in particular. We might want to ask, I mean, what is this? Is it cavalier indifference? Is it insolence coupled with ignorance? In any case, the two always seem to go together. Is it calculated ostracism, or is it a mere accident? I think it's a bit of all of that at the same time. Whatever the case, it remains the case that until the beginning of the millennium, post-colonial theory was not at all the object of informed critique, or it was seldom informed critique, no debate worthy of the name. It's still not the case. Sometimes I read those things and I wish, God, could we have, people who really oppose these currents of thoughts, but who are intelligent. Most of the critique is not intelligent. It is misinformed, it is arrogant, it's ignorant. Now, I think we cannot have this debate on your book tonight without evoking some ominous signs which are appearing not only in France, but also in Germany, in the UK, in America, where you live, and in some other places. The fact is that the kind of work you do and others do, call it post-colonial theory, critical race studies, ethnic studies, and so forth and so on, this kind of work is currently under sustained attack. These attacks are not limited to specific nations. We were talking about France. The current focus of the attack in Europe is, of course, post-colonial studies accused in Germany, for instance, of collusion with anti-Semitism. The current focus of attack in Europe is post-colonial studies in France in particular, accused of collusion with what is called the Islamo-leftism, which is capacious enough to mean everything and nothing in particular. In the US, a series of attacks against critical race theory, ethnic studies, some of which are concerted from, let's say, what we are beginning to see, coordinated, attacked as the embodiment of wokeness, the embodiment of everything despicable with the humanities. So it leads me to one first, not a conclusion, but argument or key proposition, that the task of deprovincialization, either of Europe or of America or of Africa or of Asia or China, that task of deprovincialization is still ahead of us. It's even more ahead of us now than it has ever been before. It is ahead of us now because of, in particular in the West, the resurgence of what seems to me to be late forms of Eurocentrism, neoliberal forms of Eurocentrisms, which are very different from the kind of Eurocentrism we witnessed early on during the so-called discovery of the Americas, later on during the partition of Africa, late 19th century, even different from forms of Eurocentrism, which we witnessed in the heyday, I would say, of third worldism, kind of Eurocentrism which was geared against non-alignment, the Bandung moment. What is the difference? The difference is that those early forms of Eurocentrism were, if you want, predicated upon the belief that the earth belonged to the West, the totality of the earth. It belonged to them. The difference today is that they don't believe that any longer. But they want to retreat, recede, build a fortification around them, build systems of immunization against anything that is coming from the outside. So it's a Eurocentrism of contraction, of retraction, if you want, as opposed to earlier forms of Eurocentrisms, which were predicated on conquest and occupation. Today, it's about separation. It's about cutting ties with the rest, where before it was a matter of conquering them, subjugating them, and exploiting them, extracting whatever could be extracted. So it seems to me that the project of deprovincialization, we can reread it today. We have to do it within this context. The second point I wanted to share had to do with second thing that was striking to me while reading the text. It's the historical, that's normal for a historian such as yourself, and the epistemological nature of the project. This is not something that I was made aware of when I first read the book, when it was published. But reading it a few days ago, this was absolutely striking. Of course, at the time the book was published, a number of epistemic reconfigurations or shifts were going on. And in fact, the book really builds powerfully on the kind of experimentation that was going on in those years. New bodies of thought were already involved then in rethinking the nature of knowledge itself. But it strikes me the extent to which, as we speak, recently and as we speak, new knowledge formations are in the making. The extent to which we have witnessed during those 20 years that separates us from the publication date, we have witnessed a proliferation of fields, of subfields of inquiry, the extent to which our sense of who the subject of cognition is all about, how this has changed. What should count as an object of knowledge, how all of this is changing. And you have been yourself, a very important player in these reconfigurations. I just have to refer to your latest work on the ecological crisis we're facing, so on and so on, your forthcoming book. So the other thing we have seen is the extent to which entrenched historical antagonisms between, for instance, the sciences and the humanities, the extent to which they are breaking down as a result of what? As a result of the gradual recognition that we humans are not, how should I put this, as special as we thought we were. We are entangled with other species to an extent we haven't, we didn't either imagine or have not, let's say, taken into consideration since wanted. So all of these things, I don't have the time. I mean, we are here to listen to you to a large extent. So, but you see what I mean. The terrain is shifting. Cognition, for instance, is no longer, if we are to believe the works of the likes of Catherine Hales and others, cognition itself is no longer limited to humans or organisms with consciousness, that it now extends to all life forms, including those lacking central nervous systems, such as plants, such as microorganisms, and so forth and so on. So you see where I'm trying to go. What would the project of deprovincialization mean if in these shifting terrain, in which the terms, the very terms of the epistemological debate are changing so rapidly, and questions of co-constitution, co-evolution, co-implication are becoming absolutely central to debates rather than deprovincialization. How do you address all of this? One last point, and I'll stop. I think that I would like to hear from you in any case about the part of what at least some of us are thinking about, the dialectics of deprovincialization on the one hand and planetarity on the other. I would like to hear from you about this very important question for two reasons. One, it is a question we are dealing with a lot in the part of the continent where I happen to be right now, in Southern Africa. We are rereading your work in light precisely of part of what seems to us to be an important moment of our own history, the planetary turn of the African predicament. A predicament which for a long time, since Hegel, was, let's say, framed in terms of difference. That Africa was that part of the world which was apart from the world, in terms of apartheid, if you want, philosophically as well as methodologically. But now we understand that that is really not the case, that in fact, historically, have always been part of the world, and that more and more, and very important part of the future of the planet is being played out right here. So these dialectics of provincialization, deprovincialization, and planetarity is an important way in which we are struggling with your book, in a context of a return, of course, of big questions, a return of deep history, big questions concerning the relation of human life to planetary life, in a context, you have written about this yourself after provincializing Europe, in a context of geological recasting of historical time. So those are the three comments I wanted to share with you. And I would like to thank you once again for what you have taught us. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Achille Mbembe, for all this communication. I could not resist to say that while you were talking, actually was published in AOC, the daily online media that I edit, a text that you wrote about late Eurocentrism, which is linked to what you said in your first point and the current situation. This is the text of a conference you gave recently at the Musée Quai Branly in Paris. Well, no more time for me, and I hand you the microphone, Dipesh, for all the many answers you have to give to everybody on the panel tonight.
This was a fabulously rich conversation. And I'm so grateful to all of you for everything you've said. I'm deeply honored, and I'm very grateful also to the Paris Center for actually organizing this, to both Arno and Richard. And this is, I don't think I can do justice to all the arguments that have been put forward, but I'll pick some and make my way through them. Hopefully there'll be something left to be said during the Q&A, or and you know, a conversation is of course always an ongoing business, so no conversation is ever finished. And you're all, like Achille said, we're all interlocutors of each other in different contexts, and of course what you say impacts on my thinking. One of the things I was trying to work out when I was working on Provincializing Europe was the relationship between thought and place. And I probably said so in the first chapter, that even when a thought aspires to speak for everybody, but if the thought is in prose, then the very idiomaticity of that prose, the original prose in which the thought is propounded, the very idiomatic nature of human prose makes some of the parochial nature of the thought, the place it comes from, stick to the thought, as it were. So if you could think completely symbolically with no prose, it might be a different proposition, but the thought I was dealing with was in prose. And as you know, I mean, if you read Marx in German, you do philology. If you read Rousseau in French, you become interested in the meaning of a word in the original language and what it means. And you become interested in the problem of translation when you translate thought from one place to another. And Provincializing was deeply interested in the problem of translation, both with regard to the dialectic that Lisa was talking about and different models of translation. So the first thing I have to say in agreement with all of you, particularly Achille, is that yes, it's impossible to forget that the kind of debates that's going on in France, particularly in Paris at the moment, with the statement that Frédéric Vidal made about Islamo-leftists and the kind of, may I say, unintelligent denunciations of postcolonial or decolonial critiques that sometimes come through and which have to be protested. But I also know that that because thought is related to place, you know, one interesting characteristic of Paris probably for a long time, and I've been recently reminded of this by reading some of the work that my very good friend Annie Cohen-Solal at the École Normale is doing on Picasso being treated as a foreigner in Paris through his entire stay. I mean, the city that made this man famous always considered him an alien. And that, so in some ways there's a long tradition perhaps in Paris of the problem of the foreigner, even though the problem of the foreigner gave rise also in French thought to the idea of human rights. And Julia Kristeva had a wonderful essay on the distinction between the citizens' rights and the rights of man, the rights of humans. So it's a kind of, it's both sort of the French universalism that could think of human rights and the problem of practicing that universalism, either in Paris or outside in the Francophone world or in the colonies, when it actually came to deal with difference. And here, I think Achille has two excellent essays on this French problem, addressing the French problem in his book, which came to my hands rather late, as I complained to Achille once. But they're very interesting essays, particularly two essays on this French problem, what one he calls the French kind of the long imperial winter that the French have with regard to the question of difference. And the other one is directly about this question of reception of postcolonial theory in France, in this book that is called Out of the Dark Night, the English title of the book that Achille has published, where Achille makes very interesting and productive distinction, I felt, between universalism and what he describes as in common. So the space where we come and feel we have something in common is a space where we both recognize what we have in common and what may be different about us. So actually, it's a larger space than what a universal can create. And universal can create a space where all difference is extinguished in the way you think of the universal, if that's how you think of the universal. So when you ban the burqa or ban hijab or whatever, you kind of think of universal as extinguishing difference. But the expression that Achille has in common, so that the thought of commonness, what is what, so to be together in a way where you don't extinguish difference, is particularly the problem that we all face in different parts. And actually, I might say, with regard to postcolonial theory that influenced our work, both the place of its origin and the problem of incommonness was very important. And in a way, you might say, postcolonial theory of that my generation produced, and I'm including people slightly younger, slightly older, from Gayatri to Homi, Arjun. Arjun was more into globalization, but he was in conversation with these people. And Achille, of course, a younger Achille, writing on Necropolis and on the postcolony those years when he was in America. But you see, this body of thought was triangulating the question of the universal, the question of difference, and the question of place. And the place point is very important when you think of how that postcolonial theory begins in the belly, in the Anglophone, in the Anglosphere postcolonial theory, that is, it begins not in the colonial, anti-postcolonial theater of India or Malaysia or Australia. It begins when intellectuals like Stuart Hall or Homi Bhabha or Gayatri Spivak have already migrated to the metropolitan, formerly colonial or dominant countries. And you have to remember that Stuart Hall, Homi Bhabha, Isaac Julian, Kobina Mercer, they all come together in the 1990s to organize the first conference on Fanon. And actually, it's called The Fact of Blackness, the chapter from Black in White Mass. And they all come together to fight what I would call post-imperial forms of racism. Now, most colonial countries have produced post-imperial forms of racism. In other words, with the loss of empires, I mean, like the beginning of Le Pen, the coming back to France of colonial characters who were settlers in Algeria and other places. The coming back to England of people who came back from the colonies gave rise to a particular kind of racism, which was mixed in with nostalgia for the empire, that I would regard as post-imperial forms of racism. They were quite different from the kind of arrogance and racism that the British would practice when the British were actually colonial masters in different places. So so there, the task of the reason why all these postcolonial theories felt very drawn to French theory, and particularly to Derrida and Lacan, and to Foucault as well, was to and all these people that we used to call different philosophers, was basically to find a way of thinking about difference, that is, think about incommonness that Achille was talking about, in such a way as to both acknowledge difference, but not essentialize it. So interestingly, actually, postcolonial theory in that formulation was anti-identity politics, because and my problem when I was writing Provincializing Europe was, of course, that I was pursuing that notion of difference. I was committed to universals because at the end of the day, it was very hard for me to accept uh, 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 the idea that we could be so different humans as to be members of different species. But I was not thinking species then. For me, the ground of universalism was phenomenology. So the fact that Heidegger could write design about design and say design has a sense of direction, design is quasi-human, but Heidegger never said design has a particular color of skin. And the fact that Fanon would read Merleau-Ponty and produce the problematic of racism by reading Merleau-Ponty and by seeing what was missing in racist relationships, in the construction of the human that was made possible in racist relationships, to see what was missing from Merleau-Pontian phenomenology in that construction. And remember when Fanon says that the black man has no corporeal schema. In other words, when he says the black man cannot ever forget that the black man is black, that not only in his daytime, but even in his sleep, a black man cannot forget that he's black, or a black person cannot forget that they're black. He is seeing that as a kind of deviation, as a bastardization, as a travesty of the phenomenological universal that Merleau-Ponty is claiming. So, I mean, today I realize that what phenomenology studied were actually deeply related to the history of evolution. I mean, in a way, phenomenologists were studying the evolved traits of human beings. And today I know that the evolved traits that we all share were evolved much, much earlier, much earlier than when we developed color of skin or even language, cultures. So our deepest, so in the way I began to historicize Heidegger, because Dasein was not historicized in Heidegger, Dasein was the ground, was actually going back to deep history and reading a particular book on the history of the brain, where a book called Brain for All Seasons, where actually the scientist was claiming that you can write, if you do the history of the brain, because the brain develops in modules, you can date the time from which humans were capable of experiencing boredom. Because the particular part of the brain where we experience boredom is dateable. Whereas for Heidegger, Dasein has the capacity to be bored. It's a given. And in my work, Achille, going back to, I mean, it's kind of what both you and Eva were mentioning, I began to see a conversation today between deep history, history of evolution, and phenomenology. It's just that phenomenology takes evolution for granted. But in provincializing Europe, Heidegger was my universal. Capital was a problematic universal, because capital had history 1 and history 2. But Dasein existed whether in history 1 or history 2. I couldn't think without the Dasein. And therefore, Heidegger was my ground for universal. Capital was my ground for historicization in different ways. And one of the implicit engagements with the indigenous, Eva, that happened to me, actually, it is there in the chapter called Minority History, Subaltern Pasts, where Guha, I critique Guha, who was actually studying an indigenous group in India, but theoretically incorporating them into the category peasant, not indigenous. Because subaltern studies was coming in the wake of the Chinese Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, and the whole thesis that the peasant could be the citizen, right? Unlike the book called The Peasants into Frenchmen, you know, that the peasant has to die before you get the citizen. The whole kind of argument, the political argument in China, Vietnam, in Asia and Africa and parts of Latin America too, the peasant can be citizen overnight. But he was actually studying an indigenous person, indigenous group. And And I realize now that my critique of Guha was enabled by the fact that the Australian Aboriginals were being historicized as I was writing this. This was the only indigenous group I knew. And this was giving rise to all kinds of critique of the historical discipline. And I still remember how shocked I used to be to encounter a group whose written history was 200 years old. All the sources were written by foreigners, by settlers. And the moment you went beyond that to provide professional history of Aboriginal groups, you did archaeology. And suddenly, every step in historiography is like 5,000 years, 3,000 years. And for me, who is used to 10 years, 20 years, microhistory, looking through documents here, looking through documents, for me, I said, I could not imagine being a person whose history had to be archaeology and whose kind of familiar mode of the history that I would be familiar with would be only 200 years old. So all that was seeping into provincializing Europe, except that today I become much more aware of it because of Viveiros de Castro's work, because of decolonial arguments. But I think some of that was there. Now, the thing I learned both while writing Provincializing Europe, again, wonderful to hear of these different receptions, because actually it's wonderful if the book is still living in the trenches. And if it hasn't become mainstream, but it is still alive in the trenches, which means there's still some fight left in the book. There's got to be. And that I take it as my good fortune, as manna from heaven, as my friend William Mazzarella would say, because that is one's good fortune. One doesn't, this fight is not something one creates. This fighting is created by the situation in the world. And if there is fight left in the book, I'm very grateful for that news. And that is wonderful. But I also realized that colonialism is both, anti-colonial sentiments travel as poetry. When I read Du Bois on double consciousness, or Fanon, or Césaire, or Senghor, or Achille, the sentiments against domination, they travel everywhere, irrespective of the particular context in which you find yourself. So sitting in Eastern Europe, Eva, you might find something interesting or useful in another place where some language for resisting domination is being created. But I also, as a historian, realized that there are so many different kinds of colonial contexts. And the work that my now deceased dear friend that Patrick Wolf used to do on racism, on race and capital, where he used to show how there were people whose land was wanted by Europeans. And this is the story of settler colonial countries where people's land was taken, and the moment the land was taken, their societies were decimated by disease and violence. But they were not necessarily made into laborers. And there were other people whose capacity to labor, whose labor power was wanted by Europeans. And these were people who were enslaved into plantations, into other forms of slavery from early on. India was a peculiar place where plantation was still a marginal form of exploitation. The bulk of the income came out of land as tax. So the peasant was important. And in India, they found a big scribal class, people who were already there. My ancestors who already kept accounts, wrote bureaucratic documents. And the British took them on and developed them into a middle class that got very interested in Europe. So in many ways, that's a way of saying that provincializing Europe becomes a very different project when you shift from one place to another. And even within India, I come from a group, from a class that was involved intellectually in the European Enlightenment from I'll take a few minutes more. I've used up my 20 minutes. From 18th century onwards, for particular historical reasons. So there's a particular group that I come from, which you may not even find in other parts of India, and which is why I say in the book that provincializing Europe would be a different project if it were to be carried out from some other part of India, because the Europeans had different roles to play. And that's why it's the Europe of the mind. And going back to this, then the question of dialectic that Lisa, you raised, and the question of the collective subject that José also raised, political thought. So on the dialectic, let me just say that going back today, I find that even historians who in the 60s considered themselves Marxists in England, E.P. Thompson, for instance, wrote a very interesting essay. You know how Thompson and people were dethroned from New Left Review by Perry Anderson and his friends, Tom. I mean, they were like the young Turks of English Marxism, who came and, brushed aside this old guard. And Thompson, out of hurt and pique, wrote a fabulously polemical essay called The Peculiarities of the English. And he wrote this because in the 70s, the English Marxists were complaining, why is our Marxism not as good as French Marxism? Why haven't we produced an Althusser? Why haven't we produced structuralism? So Thompson wrote an essay trying to explain why we haven't produced an Althusser and structuralism. And the essay was called The Peculiarities of the English. So this was a Marxist historian's complete investment in English history, nothing else. And within that, he was talking about what he called an abrasive dialectic. In other words, he was saying the relationship between the general and the particular is not one of easy synchronization. So even as a Marxist, he was thinking that the dialectic is already abrasive. It kind of rubs up against, they rub up against each other. It's not always harmonious. It's not always, it's got friction built into it. But by the time we were writing, and this is the point in which I try to make, but let me say, the different philosophers, I mean, Derrida's reading of Hegel had already taught us that sublation was the problem. Mediation was the problem. That sublation or mediation didn't produce the space that Achille was describing as the space of being in common. That the space where that this was too much of a universal space that gobbled up everything. And this was not a space in which you could actually negotiate difference, engage with difference. So, I mean, when one makes this critique of Hegel, one must remember that Foucault has a wonderful sentence. I don't remember exactly where, but Foucault says, however much you criticize Hegel, at the end of the road, you find that the old man is standing there waiting for you. So, but putting that aside, so we were precisely resisting sublation. So Homi, often you'll find that in Homi's writing, he'll often say, negotiating difference, not negating it. So negating there is a Hegelian term. So he's saying not negation, but negotiation. And what I try to argue, not in the Two Histories of Capital, but in the chapter on translation life world into labor, I try to argue that Hegelian mediation seems to work. It seems to work. The entire world seems to be becoming capitalist. It seems to, because a lot of negotiations, which are not about negations, are actually undergone. And that's what I call translations that do not work for a third category, but translations that are like barter, one thing for another. And the barter is arbitrary. So the arbitrariness of the sign is completely present there. And this is what is undergirding the march of capital. And that's why the sublation into capital is only a seeming sublation. And that's why I said capital can become global, but not really universal. Right? So its tentacles spread, but it has not sublated everything into it. So I oppose people who say everything has become capitalist or everything is completely swallowed up by the logic of capital. And I say no, because capital looks like it's working because all kinds of other forms of translation are working. And behind all that, to come back to José's question and maybe end there and let them open up for questions, was again an inspiration that goes back to Claude Lefort in Paris, to the situationists, a deep interest, because we had already rejected Stalinism, rejected Maoism, rejected the state, a deep interest in anarchism. And therefore all statist principles of interrogation were under question. And I think the problem we found was that when Roudet and people were going to police documents to understand the crowd, who was in the crowd, they were following what the Inquisition did with the Benandante or in Ginsburg books. The Inquisition would actually try to divide up a crowd into individuals in order to assign culpability and punish them, kill them or whatever, punish them. And we thought the Inquisition is the earliest form of the police interrogation, where the statist principles works by dividing up a collective into individuals and then punishing the individuals. Whereas if you ask people, why did you go to that fair? Why did you go to that festival? Why did you go to that violent episode? People say, oh, everybody from the village was going. And that they say in France, that they say in India, in subaltern studies. But so this is where the connection with Rancière's work, the names of history, who are the people who are actually making history, or even an interest in Badiou's interest in the event, were all of interest to us, because we were actually trying to find anarchist forms of defining the subject and not defining the subject. And we thought that defining the subject as individual would immediately make it into a statist category, that we would not follow the path of Roudet. To end up then, let me end up with something that I was reminded of recently by something that my very good friend Etienne Balibar wrote on the recent French debate on decolonial perspective. And Etienne made a very, very good point, at a very absolutely correct point, that he said, look, we live in cities, and he was talking about Paris, and we live in cities that are not harmonious. There are conflicts in our cities. The classroom has to engage that conflict without being totally swamped by the conflict. So I'll give you a quick two examples and finish. Take two categories from economics textbook. And these categories, when you read them in textbook, they look sanitized. There's nothing wrong with it. They're technical words, price. So any economics textbook will tell you that a price is where the supply and the demand curves meet. But you look at the history of the category price, you will find a 17th century English document saying the poor have become very lazy. Let's raise the price of bread to make them work. So price was a totally political category outside of the classroom. Take a category like efficiency. Efficiency in an economic textbook will tell you that it's the ratio of output by input. But you look at labor history in any colony, and you will find that the word that actually shadows the word efficiency is laziness. A famous Malaysian historian wrote a book called The Lazy Native. When you look at the English managing labor in the tropics in Malaysia, every labor official will say the most efficient workers are the Chinese, the less efficient workers are the Chinese or the Indians, and the laziest are the Malays. So interestingly, all these words that become theoretical categories within disciplines have a relationship to everyday language outside the classroom, where they're all caught up in conflicts. And I think we have to find ways of making the classroom connect with the conflictual situation outside, but at the same time make sure that the toxicity of a lot of the politics we see today, the intolerance that is there both on the left and the right, that intolerance doesn't be completely sort of choke the life of the space of the classroom where arguments need to happen. But those arguments have the duty to be connected to the world outside. So sort of just reading Etienne reminded me of this. And with that, I'll end coming back to the place and the thoughts we're having to think today. I didn't answer some of Achille's questions about Earth, but I can during the Q&A if they come up, Achille, or I'll write to you. But those are the things I think about all the time. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dipesh Chakrabarty, for this talk.
So the question is, how would you interpret the recent populist critique of human rights and of big state politics, vocal in Hungary and Poland, may be interpreted in the light of the post-colonial state of knowledge production in East Central Europe? Are these critiques amount to self-decolonization, or if they are not, then what are they? So that's a very interesting question, because in fact decolonization might lead to a kind of specific understanding of nationalism and populism. However, I just want to point out to one important problem. That when speaking about East Central Europe, we have to remember about the specificity of the region. We are living. I feel we are living in a current, in a constant fear that we might disappear from history, because it was our historical experience. And this fear leads us, on the one hand, to strong connection, this willingness to be strongly connected to Western Europe. On the other hand, right now, to this disconnection with European Union. And that's why, for example, the current power in Hungary and Poland, they are actually leading to the same direction, which means that there is a kind of the idea from the rightist movement that East Central Europe is the space to reinvent Europe as such, because of its Christian background, because of its tradition, and so on and so forth. So coming back to the question, what would be the post-colonial critique, and what would be use of post-colonial critique? Well, the interesting situation is that we have leftist post-colonial scholarship and rightist post-colonial scholarship. In fact, actually, we can't even talk about post-colonial theory in these countries, because we were never colonized in the same way as India, for example. So actually, we are talking about post-dependency studies in Poland and in Hungary, right? So the conservative post-dependency studies are talking about offensive epistemology, which means that we have to build, something from our background and to offer some idea in order to reinvent the nation. But of course, reinvent the nation means nations means coming back to the Christian tradition, being also the bulwark of Christendom. The leftist post-dependency studies are differently related to the situation, that they are very critical about this nativism and nationalization of knowledge, right? So this is how I would describe it, very simple, because our society are simply divided. And there is a strong division between the right and the left. And we have conservative dependencies, post-dependency studies, and and leftist post-dependency studies. So I see the conflict, the ideological conflict between them. Thank you.
There's a question that says, can the notion of entanglement help us move beyond both the parochial and the universal? Can I address it a little bit? Because I don't know if Achille has a very, again, an interesting essay in this book that I've been reading of his called Planetary Entanglements. The opposite of universal normally is not parochial, it's, let's say, is the particular. And normally you would think of the opposite of parochial as the cosmopolitan. And the cosmopolitan has that sense of what Achille was talking about as in-commonness. And in that space where you have something in common, but you're open to difference. So I'm not sure that cosmopolitanism, it definitely gets out of parochialism, but in my head, it doesn't address the problem of the universal. In other words, the problem of the universal, in my mind, the universal is not actionable. I mean, you have it, it exists. I mean, we are universally a species called Homo sapiens, but we can't act as Homo sapiens. But we can be in common. In other words, we can acknowledge the differences, what people call anthropological differences between us, and be in a space where we engage those differences, negotiate them, engage with them, hybridize ourselves, so that the difference is within ourselves rather than difference being completely identified with the other. And in that sense, Homi's idea of hybridization, Homi Bhabha's idea of hybridization, was very much about having the difference within rather than identifying the difference with the other. And that, I think, is Achille's space of postcolonialism. The only thing I wanted to say there, Achille, when we're talking about people wanting to fortify their part of the earth today and moving out of cosmopolitanism, and I know that there are some people who are wanting to do that. The problem they face today is that they have to deal with the planet and the oneness of the planet. So they can't actually fortify themselves against the oneness of the planet. But that's a different conversation. But the reason why I thought of the planet is because Achille has now expanded the idea of entanglement to capture the sense of the geological agency of humans by using the expression planetary entanglements. So we are entangled not only with each other, with one another, but even with something as huge as the Earth system, or what I call the planet. Shall we go on to the next question while hoping that he'll come back?
There is one question. The person says it has been answered previously. There is one question about the book and other books that wrestle with the relationship between the particular and the universal in a post-colonial context in the decade or so following the end of the Cold War. At the same time, in the West, a similar set of questions arises to address the place of difference and the importance of cultural recognition. I wonder if you could reflect on the specific political and intellectual context that produced this set of preoccupations.
I'd like to hear what Dipesh has to say about that, actually. I think it's an interesting question.
Okay. Provincializing sits alongside a sort of prominent text that wrestle with the relation between the particular and the universal in a post-colonial context in the decade or so. At the same time, in the West, similar set of questions arises difference and importance of cultural recognition. Right. I mean, I was trying to answer part of this question, I think, in what I was saying about difference philosophy and our use of it. And an interesting case to answer this question is to go back to Gayatri's, would be Gayatri's famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? And that essay begins by reading this conversation between Foucault and Deleuze in the context of May 68, when they say, as with a flourish in Gayatri's words, that we do not any longer, intellectuals don't need to play the role of prophets. People, workers understand they can be their own intellectuals and do these things. And Spivak, with the help of Derrida, reads it as a case of inattention to difference. And the difference in her case being the difference in the global distribution of labor. So basically, so she thinks that in that moment when Foucault and Deleuze seem to be giving up on their responsibility as intellectuals and saying that we don't have a role to play, people can understand themselves, make out their own problems, they have their tools, they have their ways of understanding the world, we don't need to be the prophets. Spivak's argument is that they actually at that moment are not reading difference in the very history of labor, in the very history of international division of labor, because the workers they're thinking about are basically migrant workers in Paris. There's a lot of migrant workers around in Paris in May 68. And so this is an interesting case of actually a post-colonial critic accusing some of the masters of difference philosophy of actually not being attentive enough to difference in something they're saying in that conversation. And that actually gives her a ground on which to situate her critique by using Derrida to criticize Foucault, right? But at the same time, one can't forget that both Foucault, I mean, Foucault was a master of theorist of difference, so that in the essay on genealogy, remember when he's talking about the critique of the idea of origin, and he says that you can't go from man to God. And following Nietzsche, he said you can't go from man to God because there's standing in the way. And that's why he says origin is distributed. So he's a clear theorist of difference, like Derrida. But Gayatri finds a point where he has suddenly become, through habits of thought, oblivious of difference. And Gayatri comes in there and opens up that moment to bring in Derrida, to bring in international division of labor, to go back to Marx's two notions of representation, to write that essay called Can the Subaltern Speak? But I'm citing that essay as an interesting case where post-colonial theorists with interest in difference philosophy are critiquing some of the difference philosophers from whom they have actually learned difference philosophy. So these are places where post-colonial critics and European critics come together, even though there's a little bit of friction in that coming together. Yeah.
Maybe we can have a last question because it's already 2 hours and a half. But there is a question by Aniko Ensolal, which is really interesting. I share this remark as I was struck myself by the great number of French writers that were mentioned tonight.
Right.
Many different of them, but one was missing, and Aniko Ensolal points that.
And that's Sartre.
Sartre.
That's Sartre.
How do you explain the fact that Sartre is totally?
Look, I think it's a very interesting question. No, it's a very interesting question. You know why Sartre disappeared, and this has been unfair to Sartre, is because of Fanon's withering criticism of Sartre's take on the negritude poetry. And Fanon may have misunderstood Sartre, but he was finding Sartre at that point patronizing, because Sartre was finding some inferior dialectic in negritude poetry. And I think what happened then, there are two stories there. The backstory is, take a step back and think of the rise of post-structuralism as an act of dethroning of Sartre. I mean, Sartre, today we need to go back, because Sartre, we are talking about the French, the Parisian and the French habit of considering people foreigners, not being sensitive to the colonial question. I mean, Sartre was the classic anti-colonial thinker in Paris. I mean, he would be I mean, how many people declined the Nobel Prize? I mean, the greatness of that man is his political courage. There's no question. But at the same time, what happened was, in my reading of the history, post-colonialism was seen, and particularly Foucault's rise was seen as a dethroning of Sartre. And we came into that history through Fanon's withering criticism of Sartre, which is actually repeated in David Macy's very interesting biography of Fanon. And again, as you know, like Walter Benjamin, Fanon's thesis was not accepted. Black Skin, White Mask was not accepted as a thesis. So but I think Annie is totally right to ask that question, because I think there's a need to revisit Sartre at that moment, which is so much in contradistinction to the insensitivity of the French intellectual tradition to the colonial question that we were talking about. In fact, one could say that Balibar stands in the heritage of Sartre, in actually always being interested in the post-colonial question. So no, I take Annie's point, and I think it's a very good reminder.
Well, thank you very much, Dipesh Chakrabarty, for being there tonight to answer all the contribution, and thank you to everybody on the panel for these very interesting remarks and accounts of the reception of this book that is 20 years old and still fighting, as you said, in many ways, as we have heard tonight. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Many
Bye.
thanks. That was excellent.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. It was great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes. Nice to meet you.